MPs have inflicted the heaviest Commons defeat on a government in modern history, rejecting Theresa May's EU withdrawal agreement by a majority of 230. The margin was wider than that predicted by any observers. The Commons Speaker, John Bercow, read out the result.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432. So the noes have it. The noes have it.
Within minutes, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, tabled a motion of no confidence in the government, which will be debated tomorrow. Theresa May has made clear she intends to fight on and has promised to hold talks with other parties in the hope of finding solutions she can take to Brussels. Tonight, we'll look at the scale of the defeat inflicted and its likely impact on the nature of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. In other news, the man in charge of policing at the time of the Hillsborough disaster in 1989 has gone on trial, accused of the gross negligence manslaughter of 95 Liverpool supporters. Security forces in Kenya are still working to deal with gunmen who stormed a hotel in Nairobi. A number of people are reported to have been killed. And Carol Channing, a star of American theatre for several decades, has died at the age of 97. Theresa May's Brexit deal has been rejected by MPs by a huge margin, the biggest defeat for a government for at least a century. There were 202 votes in favour and 432 against, a majority for opponents of the agreement of 230. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said he was tabling a motion of no confidence, which would allow the Commons to give its verdict on the sheer incompetence of this government.
This is a catastrophic defeat for this government. After 2 years of failed negotiations, the House of Commons has delivered its verdict on her Brexit deal, and that verdict is absolutely decisive.
The Prime Minister has offered cross-party talks on the way forward, but she said MPs needed to provide clarity on what they would support as soon as possible.
The government has heard what the House has said tonight, but I ask members on all sides of the House to listen to the British people who want this issue settled and to work with the government to do just that.
Our political correspondent Ben Wright reports on a night of high drama at Westminster.
Theresa May knew defeat loomed, but as she pleaded with the House of Commons to back her deal in the minutes before the division, the Prime Minister insisted there was no alternative to the plan on the table. She reminded MPs they had voted to hold the referendum. They had overwhelmingly backed the triggering of Article 50 to begin the Brexit talks. And she said both main parties had pledged to honour the referendum in their election manifestos last year. Mrs May said a vote against the deal would cause more division and uncertainty. MPs from all parties listened to this and then inflicted the most crushing defeat on any government in more than a century. 118 out of 317 Conservative MPs voted against the Prime Minister. The likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson trooped through the division lobby with Jeremy Corbyn and Vince Cable, united only in their opposition to Theresa May's deal. Speaking briefly and tersely to the packed Commons chamber, the Prime Minister said the government would listen.
It is clear that the House does not support this deal, but tonight's vote tells us nothing about what it does support. Nothing about how or even if it intends to honour the decision the British people took in a referendum Parliament decided to hold.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said the defeat had been absolutely decisive and immediately tabled a no-confidence motion that will be voted upon tomorrow.
I'm pleased that motion will be debated tomorrow, so this House can give its verdict on the sheer incompetence of this government and pass that motion of no confidence in the government.
But Labour's hopes of triggering a general election were immediately dashed as Tories from across the party vowed to support Theresa May's government in the confidence vote tomorrow. So did the DUP's Sammy Wilson.
We'll vote with the government. We'll vote against the Labour Party's confidence motion. We want to see the Conservative government continuing to deliver on Brexit, and that's what we never wanted a change of government. We wanted a change of policy.
Even though EU leaders have consistently said the withdrawal agreement is closed, Tory Brexiteers who voted against the deal now hope Theresa May can go and renegotiate a deal with European leaders. The former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said Theresa May's deal was dead.
What she needs to do is, with a high heart, fortified by, the massive rejection of the House of Commons, go back to our friends and partners and say, look, we need another way out of this. We know, you know, that we don't need a hard border in Northern Ireland. We know that we can negotiate a free trade deal. We know we've got the time to do it. Let's do it together.
Mr Johnson said the government should also step up preparations for a no-deal Brexit with ever more enthusiasm. That is the default scenario if a deal is not approved by Parliament by the end of March, or unless Article 50 is extended or revoked. But supporters of another referendum believe tonight's vote shifts the argument in their favour, as do advocates of a Norway-style economic arrangement with the EU. Somehow, the tribal, adversarial House of Commons must now try and work out what it does want from Brexit. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, accepted the current deal would have to change.
We clearly have to make changes. We need a negotiated agreement that can be ratified on this side. The EU don't want to have no deal either.
2 years of tortuous negotiations between Theresa May and the EU have ended with this emphatic rejection of her plan. A House of Commons that has frequently felt overlooked and sidelined during the process has hit back in an unprecedented way. Politics is in turmoil, but the Prime Minister limps on, determined to find a way of getting a deal through.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said the UK government had suffered a defeat of historic proportions. She said Theresa May should now ask the EU to extend the Article 50 deadline and organise a referendum on whether Britain should go ahead with Brexit.
Parliament's not suddenly going to manage to solve the conundrum that it's failed to solve in the last 2.5 years. People now, I think, have a right to be asked again, with everything we now know, do people still want to leave the European Union, knowing that every option for Brexit will make the country poorer than staying in the EU, destroy living standards and prospects for future generations?
The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Vince Cable, said Theresa May needed to accept the UK was now far less likely to leave the European Union.
There are several steps in front of us, including the no-confidence motion, which is going to be moved tomorrow. I think the long-term significance of this is that this is the beginning of the end of Brexit. I think one of the big next steps is going to be to take no deal off the table. She needs to take action to remove it from the table, and that can only be done by stopping or postponing Article 50.
Downing Street has set out the Prime Minister's next steps if her government survives the no-confidence vote, and it appears she may not be prepared to move much from her present position. More from our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
The Prime Minister suffered an historic defeat tonight, but she expects to win the vote of no confidence in her government tomorrow. This would see off Jeremy Corbyn's plan to oust her and force an election. Assuming she's right, she'll then begin meetings with what Downing Street call senior parliamentarians on Thursday. But Number 10 couldn't say if these MPs would include the leader of the opposition. Labour sources say no approach has been made to Mr Corbyn. And the Prime Minister wants to adhere to certain principles, or red lines, in any cross-party discussions. She still wants to achieve a deal that would give the UK control of its money, laws and borders. But crucially, she's also insisting on an independent trade policy, which, sources say, would preclude negotiating a customs union with the EU. As this is a key Labour demand, it's difficult to see how a cross-party consensus could be built unless the Prime Minister is willing to be more flexible. Downing Street had said there are currently no plans for Theresa May to return to Brussels, and that she has not accepted a need to extend Article 50, that is, to delay the UK's departure from the European Union. But when Mrs May brings her Plan B, or perhaps in truth a tweaked version of Plan A, to the Commons on Monday, MPs will have the power to propose changes.
News of the vote's result was greeted by cheers outside Parliament, where groups of protesters had gathered to voice their opposition to the deal. These people, from both Remain and Brexit-supporting groups, were pleased with the outcome.
It represents actually common sense. The deal doesn't work for anyone. certainly doesn't work for people who would like to stay in the EU, obviously. So and many people in this country still do. It was a very marginal vote, as you know. So yeah, I'm happy.
My view on tonight is I am relieved that she lost the vote. It just again shows her incompetence. She's not listening to the people. We had a referendum, 2 votes, 1 leave, 1 remain. We didn't have a tick box for a deal, and I'm here just to defend my democratic vote to leave the EU.
But at Galston Conservative Club in Norfolk, an area where 70% of people voted leave in the referendum 2 years ago, there was shock and dismay.
For me personally, I think it's very, very disappointing. It is a much larger loss than I ever expected. It was felt that there would be a defeat, but not that big.
Well, I'm absolutely flabbergasted because I felt that this deal, it gave us back control of our laws, it gave us back control of our borders. I thought it allowed us for economic growth, and it also protected jobs.
I thought it'd be a bit closer. She's rallied in the last couple of days and given some good speeches. It was a bad deal. No deal's even worse, so I don't know, where do we go from here?
The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said the result of the Commons vote had increased the risk of a no-deal Brexit. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has warned that the UK would be the first losers from such an outcome. Our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus reports from Brussels.
Within minutes of the vote in Parliament came a chorus of warnings from across the EU. Ireland, Poland and Germany all said there was now greater uncertainty and the growing risk of a disorderly Brexit, the UK leaving the EU with no deal. The Irish government said that would be a bad outcome for everyone and called on the UK to set out how it proposed to resolve what it called this impasse as a matter of urgency. Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker, speaking for the EU's institutions, repeated the same call, while Michel Barnier, who spent months negotiating the withdrawal agreement now rejected by Parliament, said the EU still wanted a deal.
Now it's time for the UK to tell us the next steps. And on our side, we will remain united and determined to reach a deal.
The European Parliament's Brexit coordinator, Guy Verhofstadt, said the UK had to come up with answers soon.
What I want is that as fast as possible we know what the position is. So today what happened is that the UK has said, what the House of Commons has said, that they don't want this deal. I want to know what deal the House of Commons really want, because otherwise you cannot make an agreement.
And in France, President Macron said the pressure was now on the British side. He predicted the UK would have to delay its departure from the EU to renegotiate. But the EU's own strategy has been left up in the air, and it too must now confront the real possibility of a looming no deal and what it is prepared to do to avoid that.
The business sector in Britain has sounded alarm bells in the wake of the government's Brexit defeat. The head of the Confederation of British Industry, Carolyn Fairbairn, said every business would fear that a no-deal Brexit was now closer, and to avoid this, a new plan was needed immediately. There were similar comments from the main body for retailers. The City of London Corporation said financial stability must not be jeopardised. Our business editor, Simon Jack, offers this analysis.
Financial markets were prepared for her to lose, but the scale of her defeat took most by surprise. More surprising still was the fact that the pound, the first financial responder to political events, gained in value after the vote, despite many, most in fact, confidently predicting a crushing defeat would send it down. So what to make of that? Using the benefit of new hindsight, some are saying the recent display of animosity in the House of Commons to the idea of a no-deal Brexit, something markets are most wary of, has convinced them that outcome is very unlikely. The other new line is that this crushing defeat for her Brexit deal makes no Brexit, at least not on March the 29th, a growing possibility. That's the financial markets, who can respond in seconds. Real businesses are not so sure. With about 70 days to go before the UK is due to leave the EU, yet another milestone has come and gone, with the future no clearer and planning for no deal more urgent. As one exasperated business group remarked, politicians are playing a high-stakes game of political poker with the future of the UK economy. On this showing, it looks more like blind man's buff.
The front pages of the morning papers leave readers in no doubt about the scale of Theresa May's defeat, a complete humiliation, according to The Telegraph. It says the rejection of her deal leaves Brexit in a state of paralysis and significantly raises the chance of Britain suspending Article 50. The I headline declares simply historic humiliation. For The Guardian, it's May suffers historic defeat as Tories turn against her. The Mirror has a picture of a glum Mrs May on the Commons front bench and the words, no deal, no hope, no clue, no confidence. The Sun shows a dodo with Mrs May's face on it and the headline, Brextinct. It says her deal is as dead as a dodo. The Mail says the Prime Minister is battling for her political life following a crushing defeat that puts Brexit in doubt. For the Financial Times, her deal will need a thorough overhaul if it's to be revived. The Express says it's time for MPs to do their duty and work with Mrs May for a deal that satisfies the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit. Well, now other news. The man in charge of policing on the day of the Hillsborough disaster in Sheffield in 1989 has gone on trial. David Duckenfield, a former South Yorkshire Chief Superintendent, denies charges of gross negligence manslaughter involving 95 Liverpool supporters. The trial at Preston Crown Court was told that each of them died as a result of extraordinarily bad failings by David Duckenfield. Our correspondent, Judith Moritz, was in court.
David Duckenfield sat in court alongside his solicitor and yards away from some of the families of the 96 Liverpool fans who died in the disaster. He's charged with the gross negligence manslaughter of 95 of the supporters. The last victim, Tony Bland, died 4 years later, in law considered too late to be included in the prosecution. Opening the case, Richard Matthews QC told the jury that David Duckenfield had both an ultimate and a personal responsibility for the policing operation. The court heard the 95 Liverpool fans all died as a result of crushing at the Sheffield ground, and that whilst there may have been an extraordinary series of collective and personal failures on the part of very many, if not all of those who were responsible, Mr Duckenfield's exceptionally bad failings were a substantial cause. It said that the match commander breached the duty of care which he owed to the fans. The youngest to die was just 10, the oldest 67. The court was silent as all 95 names were read out. Another man is also on trial. Graham McCrell was Sheffield Wednesday's club secretary and safety officer at the Hillsborough ground. He's said to have failed to make safe arrangements for fans to get into the ground and to make contingency plans. Both men deny the charges against them. The trial is expected to last for up to 4 months.
There's been more gunfire tonight in Kenya, where security forces are battling to retake control of a luxury hotel complex from armed militants. Kenya's head of police said gunmen stormed the compound in Nairobi after a suicide bombing. Witnesses say they've seen at least 4 dead bodies. There are also reports of a number of wounded people still trapped inside the complex. The Somali Islamist group Al-Shabaab said it was behind the attack. Tommy Aladipo reports from Nairobi.
As gunfire sounded from inside the complex, 3 burning vehicles in the car park sent a thick cloud of smoke into the sky. Security forces arrived in batches and guided out a stream of visibly terrified people. BBC teams saw 2 men being carried out with gunshot wounds. Local media has broadcast CCTV footage from the scene, which shows 4 gunmen walking through the car park and at one point firing their weapons. In a public address this evening, Kenya's Interior Minister Fred Matiang'i said the situation was under control and that all the affected buildings had been secured. But Kenyans are still reporting friends and relatives trapped inside. The Al-Shabaab jihadist group put out a brief statement saying its militants carried out the attack.
The former president of Ivory Coast in West Africa, Laurent Gbagbo, has been cleared of war crimes at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. He was arrested 7 years ago and accused of orchestrating a campaign of violence after elections in 2010, which left 3,000 people dead. As our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports, the failure of the case is a blow to the court's credibility.
Celebrations for some in the Ivory Coast today. Laurent Gbagbo's supporters welcoming the collapse of their former president's trial. But for the International Criminal Court, this is a humiliation, and by no means the first. The judges didn't even wait for Mr. Gbagbo's long trial to finish before dismissing the prosecution's case.
There is no need for the defense to submit further evidence, as the prosecutor has not satisfied the burden of proof in relation to several core constitutive elements of the crimes as charged.
And so Mr Gbagbo joins a growing list of prominent African leaders from Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, who've either avoided extradition to the ICC or seen their trials collapse. I was in the Ivory Coast during its civil war and saw the militia groups and the killings that President Gbagbo was accused of directing after he lost an election in 2010. But today's ruling is a reminder of how hard it can be to link powerful men in turbulent countries to specific acts of violence, and to do so beyond reasonable doubt. The court's critics, and there are many now here in Africa, are likely to argue that the ICC, with its poor track record, is no longer fit for purpose. But there are many victims of conflict and supporters of international justice who believe that the ICC still has a vital role to play.
The main opposition party in Zimbabwe, the MDC, has accused security forces of shooting 3 people dead during a second day of violent protests about rising fuel prices. Soldiers have been deployed in Zimbabwe's main cities to deal with disturbances. At the weekend, President Mnangagwa ordered that prices be doubled to deal with chronic shortages. Donald Trump's nominee for the post of US Attorney General has insisted that he'll protect the independence of an inquiry into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election, despite previously criticising Robert Mueller's investigation. William Barr was testifying under oath at a Senate confirmation hearing. Our North America editor, John Sopel, was watching.
William Barr comes across as a no-nonsense, old-school lawyer with firm views that politics mustn't be allowed to interfere with the rule of law, particularly given how divided America is today. The hottest of hot potatoes that he must deal with is the results of the special counsel inquiry on whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia during the presidential election. In his evidence, Mr. Barr made clear that he wants Robert Mueller's investigation to continue. The President has repeatedly asserted that Mr. Mueller is conflicted, the inquiry is a witch hunt, and that the previous Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, should never have recused himself from overseeing it. Point by point, under questioning from the Judiciary Committee Chairman, Lindsey Graham, Mr. Barr rebutted every one of those details.
You say you've known Mueller a long time. Would you say that you understand him to be a fair-minded person?
Absolutely.
Do you trust him to be fair to the President and the country as a whole?
Yes.
Do you believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt against anybody?
I don't believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt.
Do you believe that Attorney General Sessions had a conflict because he worked on the Trump campaign?
I think he probably did the right thing recusing himself.
Mr. Barr, who is now 68 years old and served as Attorney General during the administration of George H.W. Bush in the early 1990s, is at the end of his career. As such, he'll be his own man at the Department of Justice, and it looks like he's not someone to be pushed around, though doubtless some will try.
A coroner has said there were multiple system failures in the care of a 10-year-old girl who died from an asthma attack. Sophie Holman from East London suffered numerous attacks and had frequently been taken to her GP and to hospital, but there was no coordination of her care. Our health correspondent Jane Draper has been following the inquest at Walthamstow Coroner's Court.
Sophie Holman died just before Christmas 2017. The inquest heard she'd collapsed in the street as her parents were trying to take her to hospital earlier that day. The coroner, Dr. Shirley Radcliffe, said there'd been a failure by the GP surgery and hospital doctors to grasp the long-term management of Sophie's asthma. Earlier, the inquest heard evidence that along with almost all of the 25 to 30 asthma deaths among UK children each year, Sophie's had been preventable. A GP who's an expert in childhood asthma, Dr. Mark Levy, told the hearing Sophie saw 16 different doctors and 10 different nurses during her life, but no one took an overview. The inquest heard details of how Barking, Havering and Redbridge University Hospitals Trust and the GP surgery in East London had since improved their procedures.
Labour has been fined £12,500 by the Electoral Commission for failing to deliver an accurate and timely record of donations it received ahead of the snap general election in 2017. A spokesman for the Labour Party said a genuine administrative error had been to blame. In the city, the 100 share index ended the day 40 points higher at 6,895. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones closed up 156 points at 24,066. Scientists at the physics research centre Cern in Switzerland have announced proposals for a much bigger particle accelerator to replace the Large Hadron Collider. The Future Circular Collider, as it's currently known, will cost £20 billion and be almost 10 times more powerful than the current machine. This report from our science correspondent, Palab Ghosh.
The Large Hadron Collider is the largest, most powerful particle accelerator in the world, but not large and powerful enough, according to Cern. Researchers there discovered the most important subatomic particle to date, the Higgs boson, which gives other particles mass, in 2012. But so far they haven't discovered the subatomic particles that they believe must exist to account for currently inexplicable astronomical observations, such as the accelerating expansion of the universe. Cern has therefore proposed a new accelerator that would be nearly 10 times more powerful than the LHC. Such higher energies would require a 62-mile underground circular tube around which particles would be accelerated. That's around 4 times the length of the current ring. Professor John Butterworth from University College London is a member of an international panel of physicists considering the proposal.
My personal take at the moment is that this Future Circular Collider integrated program is a very ambitious but very exciting way forward, and it would be my plan A.
Critics argue that the escalating cost of conducting basic research in particle physics means that government should consider whether the money could be better spent on research into other, more pressing priorities, such as combating climate change.
One of the greatest stars of American theatre of the 20th century, the singer and actress Carol Channing, has died at the age of 97. She won acclaim in the title role of the 1964 Broadway musical Hello, Dolly, and as Lorelei Lee in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Our arts correspondent David Sillito looks back on the life of a true star of the stage.
Hello, Harry, well, hello.
With platinum bob and eyes and smile that you could see from the back of the upper circle, Carol Channing didn't so much play the role of Dolly Levi in Hello, Dolly, she owned it. 5,000 performances. It even earned her a place on Richard Nixon's enemies list when it was used as a Democrat campaign song. So the decision to cast Barbra Streisand in the film version was like a bereavement, but she never let it show. On her many chat show appearances, there was always laughter. This is her story of her first meeting with the head of the William Morris Talent Agency.
There I was, face to face with this great man himself, see. Well, I swung right into my first numbers, a simple ancient Gallic dirge. I remember how Mr. Lastfogel's eyes filled with wonderment as I showed him how the women of the Greek chorus lamented the ravages of war.
Amazingly, he signed her, but her big break was the show Gentlemen Prefer Blondes.
A kiss on the They wrote the score when I was sitting right there. But diamonds are a girl's best. They wrote it just for me. Now, isn't that an honor?
But again, when it came to the film role, she lost out, this time to Marilyn Monroe. When she did finally make it onto the big screen in Thoroughly Modern Millie, she won an Oscar nomination.
Girl now, fellas.
But her natural home was the stage, especially the role she made her own.
Now back to our main story. Theresa May's Brexit deal has been rejected by MPs by a majority of 230, the biggest defeat of any government in more than a century. The result prompted Labour to table a vote of no confidence in the government. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, considers what a tumultuous day in Westminster means for the Prime Minister and the UK's departure from the EU.
Theresa May promised MPs that if she survives, there will be an attempt to listen to what they really want, an effort at this very late stage to find common cause in Parliament. But her team was quick to suggest that while she's promising to listen, she has no intention at this stage of dropping her own firm commitments, making it clear she wants to stick to setting an independent trade policy, a key claim which so far shuts down a chance of moving to a Labour-friendly customs union. It doesn't sound like she has much enthusiasm for junking her hard-won deal. Indeed, a source that was on a conference call with business leaders hosted by the Chancellor was told the government could not renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, the divorce deal. Instead, the plan is for a shakedown of MPs in the next few days to find out what they would tolerate in terms of promises for the longer-term relationship. The cabinet itself does not even have a clear view on how she should proceed. The leader of the House of Commons told me it's Brussels that has to move, but others are crystal clear that the Prime Minister will have to soften her offer, because that, in the end, is what Parliament itself will tolerate.
Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg. BBC News.